And I think you told me this on the air that when you approached Greg Sankey, that he looked like he'd swallowed a hand grenade.
He did. I caught it. It was one of those things, George, where if I had heard this news while I was sitting in the Bryan College Station Bureau, the Houston Chronicle, which is actually a converted garage in Bryan, Texas, where I'm old school. I'm one of the last bureaus left, but based in College Station. Had I gotten that news there, I would have been calling the SEC offices. I'd have been trying to reach Greg Sankey any way possible. In this instance, I was able to walk downstairs, find him on Radio Row, and yeah, he caught himself a little bit, and kind of said something along the line, "Where'd you hear that?" And then he caught himself and said, "No comment, rumors are swirling," which that rumors are swirling response happened to match up with what Texas was saying too. When we got response from them, they actually used that term, rumors are swirling. So there to be some connections there. And then, and he and I visited with that later, and he knew I did what I had to do in that moment. But it was unique in the sense that it was at SEC Media Days in Hoover. So I was able to just walk downstairs as opposed to making phone calls. And that was all by coincidence, George. As I told you last year, that all stemmed from me doing a 10-year anniversary story on then A&M President Bowen Lofton saying the Big 12 is in a state of uncertainty. And I was looking for summer stories. And it so happened that based on that and having some of those old timers go back and forth is what led to that. And it so happened that the Texas OU story broke on July 21st, 2021, 10 years to the day after the other story that I broke about A&M saying the Big 12 was in a state of uncertainty. So it was 10 years to the day, and I also know that day because it's also my anniversary, which my wife has reminded me.
Happy anniversary.
Yeah, thank you. We actually celebrated before I head to Atlanta for SEC Media Days this year.
Yeah. This is probably a dumb question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. This move has created complete chaos in college football. And we've seen 14 million moves in reaction to it since then. Do you think there was ever a point where Greg Sankey in a private moment said, I need to tell Texas and OU to stay where they are for the good of the game and not necessarily the good of the SEC?
I don't think so, and here's why. Because he would have, their thinking was at this point, from having visited with so many people in the past year on this, is that Texas and Oklahoma were looking to get out of the Big 12 no matter what. So if it wasn't going to be the SEC, which makes sense geographically, it's still just crossing a river and not crossing the entire Midwest or a desert to get to a new league, then they would have turned their attention to possibly the Big Ten, the ACC along those lines. So there was never that thought, if you're trying to add those two programs, those two prominent programs, you would never have passed on that opportunity and then watched them go elsewhere. And then you're trying to add another couple to become a super conference at that point. So I don't think that ever crossed his mind. When Texas and Oklahoma came to him about that, I think it was full throttle go from the beginning with no looking back, with the idea that they could add these two programs, these two ones who had had success, particularly in football, historically, as opposed to them going to another conference and causing him a little more consternation on that front.
Okay, another kind of dumb question. Did Texas and OU just sit down together, even though I think they hate each other, and say, let's contact the SEC? How do you think that all started?
I think it was contact among their very, very top officials and saying, hey, this Big 12 thing is not working out for the long term, and look where this game is headed. Look where this college athletics is headed. And so even despite their many differences, got together and said, SEC is our first choice. Let's go see what, and from everything I understand, it was their first choice, because again, it does. I'm still one of those old school guys like you, George. To me, things make sense geographically in terms of travel when you're talking about some of the other sports, women's basketball or whatever on down the line, that they're not that far away. And so why would you go to the ACC when you could go to the SEC? So I do think that the very top of the chain at Texas and Oklahoma, they got together and they said, okay, let's go to Greg Sankey and see where this goes from here.
Brent, Uh, Gundy brought up a few days ago the whole, why are they even in our meetings? And that, maybe he was kidding. I'm not convinced he was. I think he was
You
saying,
never know with him. Yeah.
yeah, I think he was saying, you all need to get the hell out of here.
Right.
What is causing the delay in Texas and OU coming to the SEC?
Georgia, it was so interesting because I covered A&M a decade ago, which is now more than a decade ago because they had just celebrated their 10-year anniversary of joining the SEC. When all that first came out, same type situation with A&M and then adding Missouri to it, the idea that it was going to be maybe 3 years, but 2 years before A&M left the Big 12 for the SEC. Well, things were so ugly and awkward for the Aggies in particular. That was my discipline. That's who I was covering. So I saw it up front that things started accelerating. So within a year of all that coming out of that breaking news, they're joining the SEC. It was a much less complicated situation. Texas and Oklahoma would love to be joining, but would love to be probably in the SEC this year. If it had been a similar situation, they would have already been in and would be playing an SEC football schedule this fall. It's not a similar situation. All the TV contracts, all the exit fees. The Big 12 was able to survive a decade ago because it still had Texas and Oklahoma. Now you're losing your two bell cows at that point, and then you're facing some big time issues. So it all proved to be a much more complicated situation than what Texas A&M went through a decade ago when the Big 12 was saying, okay, you want out, go ahead. And they're sitting there thinking to themselves, well, we still have Texas, we still have Oklahoma. This can still be a viable league, even though they had also lost Nebraska even before that. Much more complicated situation, especially from a way an A&M athletic administrator explained it to me. The TV contracts in particular are what makes it seem like they would not be able to exit prior to now 2025. Of course, July 2025 is the official date. Everyone seems to think it'll be maybe 2024. But the idea, he said, it seems like it would be almost next to impossible for it to be 2023. But you and I both know contracts can be torn up if the right money comes along, if the right donor, the right you got it, the right booster at Oklahoma comes along and says, okay, fine, I'll pay that exit fee or whatever it is. Because my understanding was as well, Texas could have done it sooner with its financial backing. Oklahoma wasn't quite in that position to make that move by, say, 2022 or 2023.
Okay, I want to pick your A&M background up here. I've known Ross Bjork for a long time, going back to when he was the athletic director at Western Kentucky. Okay. I know I'm paraphrasing, but I think he said something to the effect, when your story got out, over my dead body is Texas coming into this league. Did he really not know anything?
He had had an inkling. He had, it was like a few of us, you hear things along the way. A&M's immediate response was, no. Texas A&M is going to be, Mike Slive said, Texas A&M is going to be the only school from the Lone Star State in the SEC. Well, it was obvious right away that was not going to hold up. So once the top brass at Texas A&M really got together, they within a few days, I can remember being at my brother-in-law's pool in Bryan, Texas, off to the side with my laptop while the kids are swimming, and hearing from A&M that they were going to change directions, that this was going to be, all right, bring it on. Let's renew the rivalry. And to me, from the very beginning, as a fifth-generation Texan, how can Texas and Texas A&M not play every year, in terms of the money? And I know that's still being discussed in terms of annual rivalries and so forth. But to me, it made sense from the beginning. And then A&M said, okay, we can't stem this tide in terms of saying, no, we don't want Texas in the league, because the future of college athletics and the way things are rolling, yeah, they need Texas and Oklahoma to make sure that the SEC stays the number one conference in the nation. So, yeah, it was a sense of they didn't want to believe it was happening, but once they found out that it truly was happening and it was really going to happen, then they begrudgingly got on board, George, at that point.
Easily said, huh?
Yeah, I want to say the Regents vote was something like off the top of my head, like 8-1. There was one holdout going, no, no, no. But the rest of them said, okay, this is for the good of the SEC and not necessarily just for the good of A&M. Although in my mind, it's also for the good of A&M because the money that game brings in and the renewing of that rivalry and knowing that when Texas basketball comes to Reed Arena at Texas A&M, it's going to be a sellout and things like that. That's all good for these programs, and especially with the way things are headed on the money front.
I'm going to run a theory by you, and this may be where you say, this is the dumbest stuff he's put out here yet. But I hear this a lot in the Southeast, a lot of this. Well, Texas and Oklahoma, they've got a bunch of J.R. Ewing wannabes, and they've got this attitude, and they think they're coming in and they're going to tell the conference how to run. And by golly, they're just another in a series of them, and Alabama's stronger and Georgia's stronger, and they're not going to tell this conference how to operate. Do you think there's going to be some of that kind of attitude early?
I don't think so, because I've done this for a quarter century now and have seen how Texas has always been the big guy on the block, even if their results haven't been on the field the past decade. In terms of calling the shots, they called the shots in the Southwest Conference, which was one of the reasons it broke up. They called the shots in Big 12, which was why Nebraska, or at least thought they called the shots, tried to call the shots, which was why Nebraska and Tom Osborne, they got out of there. We're out of here. I don't think it's going to be that way in the SEC. I think they realize they're getting to be a part of something that's much bigger than what they are. And I've seen it firsthand over the past decade. And I think it's been a whole lot of fun, and it's been really advantageous and really a positive thing for Texas A&M to be in the SEC. I think Texas realizes that. I don't think it's going to be a situation where the Horns, and I can't really speak for the Sooners because I don't think that they were never in that same position in the Big 12 in terms of being like Texas and trying to say, hey, we're the Joneses, as Lost Odds used to say. So I really don't think it's going to be that situation. I don't think it's going to be, look at the Longhorn Network. It's probably going to dissolve or be mixed in with the SEC network or whatever their plans are for that. 10 years ago, A&M used the Longhorn Network as their excuse to get out. So it is interesting now that that's probably going to be dissolved as all part of this. And I do think Texas on that front, and plus Texas that name doesn't mean what it meant a decade ago too, after Mac Brown had won national title and had him in the national title game and had him as one of the nation's better programs. They have a lot to prove again, on that front. If we're talking about the bread and butter, the money, the breadwinner, football. So they'll come into the league, and I don't think it's going to be a situation where they try to throw their weight around. And I don't really see that moving forward either, because the SEC is much bigger and much more powerful than a program like Texas.
How do you think the SEC is going to figure all this out, scheduling and dividing into divisions? And do you think Clemson and Florida State types are headed to the SEC?
That's a tough one, because then you say, is this eventually going to be the way it's headed right now? Is it going to be the NFC versus the AFC in terms of college football with, 32 on each side or what have you? So in terms of scheduling, and this is wishful thinking on my part as a guy who always looked forward to the A&M Texas game as a kid, and then suddenly I'm getting to cover it, and man, what a thrill that is. I really, really hope they go with that 9-game schedule where you have 3 rivals. Because Texas and Oklahoma have already said that they would be the annual meeting between those two in the SEC if it's just the 8-game league schedule and you play the one permanent rival. So where does that leave the Aggies? Suddenly they're playing the Longhorns every other year and so forth. I just don't see how that's going to work. I know some of the programs, your Vanderbilts and so forth, don't necessarily want that. But from like an A&M perspective, you want to play Texas every year. You want to play LSU every year, and maybe Arkansas. The old Southwest Conference get together that they have as well. So I do think, and again, maybe it's wishful thinking, that they end up going with that 3 permanent rival deal, because there are if you look across the SEC, it's not just Alabama versus Auburn, it's Alabama versus Tennessee, and, and on down the line. You got to play those annually. Now, in terms of whether Clemson, Florida State, yeah, you can see where a guy like Greg Sankey is looking around going, okay, I guess we got to add more because the Big Ten is doing the same thing. Over there. And so, yeah, man, that's a tough one in terms of whether it is going to end up being just like 2 major super conferences. It certainly looks like that might be the direction it's headed.
Last thing for you. when these schools all get together at these meetings in May and throughout the year, does anybody in the room say, let's get rid of Vandy? They bring very little to the table.
I hear you. On down the line, I don't think that's anything immediate, but as things continue to progress, I mean, I love those trips to Nashville and so forth, the ones I've been able to take part in when A&M's played Vanderbilt and so forth. But yeah, you do wonder, but then you look at it again and go, hey, they've won some baseball titles and so forth. They've contributed on that front. Football is always going to be one of those tough deals, just like Rice was in the Southwest Conference. You just didn't expect them to compete for titles in the later years of it. So if you have that expectation, I haven't heard that specifically, but you do feel like maybe if there's a lot of shuffling going on down the line as they are trying to position themselves and beat, crazy as it may sound, 32 teams and everything, that maybe they would not be part of that equation, but I haven't heard anything specifically on that front. And I'm always feel like I'm always glad to have programs like that as part of a conference as well, that are, big on academics as well and so forth.